Let me welcome you to Gund Hall, to occupying this classroom. My name is Jerold Kayden. I'm a professor of urban planning and design and director of the Master in Urban Planning program here at the Graduate School of Design. But in another aspect of my life, I'm also someone deeply interested in public space in cities around the world, specializing in particular in a certain category of public space, privately owned public space, that has intrigued me intellectually as well as practically. And I was so intrigued about it that I wrote a book about it called Privately Owned Public Space, The New York City Experience, and then subsequently founded and continue to head a small not-for-profit organization called Advocates for Privately Owned Public Space, which attempts to serve as a watchdog, a curator, a steward of the almost 550 privately owned public spaces that exist in New York City. In future years, people will remember the year 2011 as the year in which physical public space reclaimed lofty status in the public sphere, thanks to the audacious actions of engaged individuals. From Tahrir Square to Zuccotti Park today, physical public space has aggressively reminded the world of its centrality in accommodating and nurturing political debate and protest, and especially at a time when the digital world has claimed its place in the public space sphere. Physical public spaces come in many flavors. We're all very familiar with publicly owned, city-owned streets and sidewalks and parks. But there is also, in New York City, in other cities across the United States, and even in some cities around the world, a zoning-created category of public space known as privately owned public space, what I call from time to time law's oxymoronic invention. It's an oxymoron. How can a space be both privately owned and truly be a public space? And the answer is because law says it is so. We are not here talking about regional malls or department stores or restaurants or other so-called public facilities that at the end of the day remain private property, subject in general to closings at any time by the owner, who may not close because it's not in his or her business interest, but who has that power. These are special spaces created through a zoning kind of transaction. Indeed, it's called incentive zoning. And the City of New York relaxed certain provisions in its zoning ordinance, which would provide extra money or reduced costs to the developer in return for the provision of plazas and arcades and indoor spaces. By now, close to 550 of them scattered principally in the borough of Manhattan, downtown, midtown, Upper East Sides, and Upper West Sides. So this transaction was to give something to the developers, who were thus incentivized to provide the public spaces. They weren't forced to do it. And indeed, the biggest incentive was the so-called floor area bonus, in which the city granted developers the right to build above and beyond what the zoning otherwise allowed. In fact, through the year 2000, starting in 1961, the city granted more than 20 million extra square feet of residential and commercial space to developers of residential and office towers in return for these privately owned public spaces. The signature requirement across all of the public spaces is that they be usable by the public. Not at all times necessarily. It could vary space to space. But at the fundamental level, they have to be usable by the public. Zuccotti Park City is one of these now roughly 550 privately owned public spaces in the city. Although I think referring to it as one in 550 understates the seismic role it is playing as I speak. Many actors are in this unfolding drama. The activists of Occupy Wall Street, the property owner, various agencies and officials of city government, ranging from the city planning department to the mayor's office, to the mayor, to the police. Neighbors and other members of the public, all are involved in this drama. How was Zuccotti Park created? Well, interestingly, in its case, it was not created by the granting of a floor area bonus. But at the same time, it was created by another type of incentive zoning, in which the city granted concessions to the developer of an office tower immediately to the north of the space. And those concessions involved reducing certain rules related to height and setback requirements and tower coverage requirements and floor area distribution requirements on the lot. Nothing that anybody really has to worry about other than knowing that that was of value, financial value to the developer. And it in return provided what you see in front of us. This is Zuccotti Park. Originally, by the way, known as Liberty Park. So what I'd like to do first is take you through Zuccotti Park. That is not the way it looks today, by the way. But I'd like to take you through it and then discuss how we should understand what is happening in this privately owned public space. Before I begin with the 50-slide tour, let me ask how many of you have been to Zuccotti Park? All right, so this will be new for most of you. So this is indeed Zuccotti Park a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever. These are the rules that have been posted at Zuccotti Park. It's open to the public. That happens to be the city planning department's logo, the zoning logo for privately owned public space in the city, indicating that it's legally required to be open and usable by the public. And the owners of Zuccotti Park attached that sign to the space from years ago saying no skateboarding, rollerblading, or bicycling allowed in the park. Those were the rules before Occupy Wall Street. So I don't see any skateboarding, and I don't see any, well, but this is what one does see. And here's the space today as occupied, absolutely quite dramatically occupied. You know, the trees are there, but there are a lot of people there. It's occupied as a movement. We can use the word politics, although some people object to that, but there are lots of political messages being delivered, and here are some of them. That's a pizza box. And by the way, a good instruction about isms, I guess. Now, this is not a disorganized kind of activity. In fact, over a period of days, this horizontal General Assembly, leaderless movement has remarkably organized its activities within this space. So it has an information area. And here are two of the women who are manning the information booth and providing information to the public and telling us what we can and cannot do, and being cagey about answering questions that I asked. Who are you? They said. They post daily in writing a little news update for the space. It's like a cruise ship. You know, what's the weather going to be like? What's happening? They've got their computer rigs out there because they are broadcasting indeed to the world. They've got their outreach location. They've got a place for municipal unions and private unions to gather. They've got a library. Indeed, it's the People's Library. They serve food. There's a big article in the New York Times today about food in Zuccotti Park, and they serve it to all comers. There's a barber. And they store stuff in one location in particular. They provide sleeping facilities, and people are sleeping. They have a lot of entertainment, and politics is entertainment, entertainment is politics. Here's someone who is asking people to come and draw on his board, and they do. They've got music. Some neighbors think it's loud music. They have performance art. And the press is there. There's, you know, the indomitable Keith Olbermann, that little head in the back. You know, everybody's making their cameo appearance. I think this is somebody from Saturday Night Live. I'm not sure. Does anybody recognize him a little bit? Little guy in front. A lot of press people there. This is worldwide news, and they are reporting like crazy. This guy's running for president of the United States, and he's speaking at the space, trying to convince people that he should be elected. Notice the birds that are listening. And you can do everything that you can do at other privately owned public spaces in the city as well, such as eat a sandwich, as this woman and this fellow are indeed doing. Or you can play chess or checkers. You can do yoga, meditate. You can just sit and people watch. You can talk and talk. Now, as I said, it's attached to the north. You've seen the space itself, roughly 25,000 square feet. You've seen the space itself. To the north, immediately one block, immediately right across the street is the tower, which is, has these zoning concessions in it. It's not larger because of Zuccotti Park, but it's differently configured, and it was a benefit to the developers. And it's called One Liberty Plaza. As I said, the park was originally called before being named after John Zuccotti, who was the chair of Brookfield Office Properties, co-chair. And it was named after him. A very well-respected New York real estate attorney, land use attorney, who has served in public roles. He was chair of the New York City Planning Commission for several years, and a very straightforward, good guy. In any event, that's the owner of the space. And you can see that the owner of the space has, are these the tenants? No. This is the New York City Police Department, which is surrounding the space, but not in the space. They're on the public sidewalk and the streets. And they are engaging around the periphery and in the periphery. And they're making sure that on the sidewalk, people don't stand around, hold signs, or block pedestrian traffic. Go and do that in that privately owned public space, but don't do it on the publicly owned sidewalk. And they're very clear about it. You, at that moment, have more rights in the space than you have on the public sidewalk that's publicly owned. Notice what might be deemed by some an inversion. So there they are, guaranteeing, that things are secure in general. And generally speaking, everybody's gotten along quite well. I think they're both amused and mystified by all of this at times. So, as I said, there's the building, One Liberty Plaza, juxtaposed against our performance artist. There's the building that did get the large, this extra height and setback, et cetera. There, by the way, right across the street, I want to point out, is another privately owned public space, another of the roughly 550 in the city. It's a plaza. It's got a Noguchi designed cube on it, sculpted cube on it. Nobody's there, nobody's gathered there. It's just literally right across the street. They could gather there. And then right down a couple blocks away is a public park, City Hall Park, right in front of City Hall, all right? And this is it literally at the same time. You know, those photographs that I took were, you know, taken 5 minutes before this. And this, a little more, you know, activity there, but, you know, in terms of guarding the entrances, but nobody's in this space for any purpose whatsoever other than to sort of sit and enjoy it as a park. As Zuccotti Park might have looked right before Occupy Wall Street decided to occupy it. So the issue is, finally, for us, for Occupy Wall Street, for all members of society, what do we make of this? Not in terms of the politics of Occupy Wall Street, which I think strike many as very noble and a powerful and important message to be heard. And we certainly treasure political discourse in cities. The issue is, what can the private owner of this space do if it wants to do something at all with its private property, which happens to be not just private property, but a privately owned public space? And I just want to point out, these are the rules that the City of New York applies to its parks in general. City Hall Park, right down the street. And if you notice, as you go down the list, you get to a point where it says, you know, no performing or rallying, this is in the top left box, fourth from the bottom, except by permit. So if Occupy Wall Street descended on City Hall Park, a publicly owned park right next to City Hall, and let's say they wanted to take their message to City Hall rather than to Wall Street, they would have to get a permit to appear. Whereas in this sort of indeterminate privately owned public space, that doesn't appear to be the case, or we're just simply unsure about that. So let's go over, just with a little more detail, you know, how it's described. In the document, the legal document which created the space, it refers variously to a plaza, to an open landscape area with trees, sitting areas, and the necessary lighting. And it refers to what amounts to a permanent open park in the heart of one of the most densely built up areas in the world. And this legal document, this special permit, says it is principally because of this public benefit that the Commission, referring to the City Planning Commission, has viewed this application for the various zoning concessions that I mentioned with favor. So it's clearly and unambiguously a trade. By the way, in 2005, the owners of this space went to the city and asked the city to modify, told the city it wanted to modify the space through certain improvements, including the planting of 55 honey locust trees, the addition of 1,010 linear feet of fixed seating, 16 fixed tables with fixed seats, an abstract steel sculpture, and new lighting. And the owner subsequently also did change the name, you know, the prescient name Liberty Park, to Zuccotti Park, named after, indeed, John Zuccotti. So given this sort of legal provenance of the space, how should one judge the current use by the hundreds, if not thousands, of people constituting Occupy Wall Street? Well, to begin with, Zuccotti Park is a one-off. As lawyers would say, it's sui generis in the privately owned public space world. There happen to be a lot of other categories expressly defined in the zoning resolution dealing with public spaces. Indeed, there are 4 plaza types that are actually set forth right now in the zoning resolution, and you can read their definitions. One is called plaza, one is called residential plaza, one is called urban plaza, and one is called public plaza. It sounds ridiculous to the normal person. To a zoning lawyer, it's still a little bit funny to think that we have all these names for plaza. Why can't we just have one name for plaza? And indeed, today the city thinks of public plazas altogether. Well, Zuccotti Park is not any of those, but it is what it is, which is this open landscaped area, this plaza, this park in the heart of the city that must be provided. So, if Zuccotti Park were one of these sort of defined plazas, in general the rules have been that they must be open and accessible to the public at all times. In fact, when the idea of the plaza was first introduced in 1961 in the 1961 New York City zoning resolution, which was a replacement for the original comprehensive 1916 zoning resolution in New York City, the definition of plaza required that all plazas provided be open and accessible to the public at all times. As social conditions changed, and as, quite frankly, homeless people began to appear in these privately owned public spaces, the owners and the city saw fit to introduce an amendment to the zoning that would allow, in certain cases, upon application, the authorization for a nighttime closing, meaning that plazas could be closed at night, strictly, clearly, unambiguously for the purpose of guaranteeing that, not to prevent Occupy Wall Street, which was not in anybody's imagination, but that people couldn't sleep in the space overnight. And a lot of plaza owners and some of the later public spaces have applied for or received authorization for nighttime closing. Zuccotti Park has no such provision attached to its space. So the owners could not, at least in terms of some provision in the existing document or in the zoning law, close their space. So what can they do? Can they dislodge Occupy Wall Street if they choose to do so? Can they limit the activities of Occupy Wall Street if they choose to do so? We saw their simple set of rules that existed prior to the occupation by Occupy Wall Street. They did apparently come forward with new rules post-Occupy Wall Street, which they're entitled to do, to change the rules of the game in response to new conditions. And they did. And they tried to restrict what could occur within the space, including setting up tents, staying overnight, etc., all of which has been ignored. And they have not seen fit to go in and say, these are our rules and we're going to try and enforce them. And how, by the way, might they enforce those rules? By claiming that by ignoring my rules in my private property, you, my friends, are trespassing. And so that would allow them to call upon various authorities to come in and begin to clear out the space. Obviously, the legality of what could occur is quite different from the reality of what they will choose to do, because this is, at the end of the day, a high-stakes game that everybody is playing and that everybody wants to be very, very careful about. So, what then is the story? Has the city instructed owners of privately owned public space, including Zuccotti Park, about what rules they might impose on conduct on users of spaces? Unfortunately, the answer is no, although one could argue fortunately for Occupy Wall Street. There are no rules set forth by the city about the rules that private owners may impose. Let me read to you from a book I happen to like, or at least I wrote it, in which this problem is discussed. So here's Privately Owned Public Space, the New York City Experience. It's written by me, but notice it also has the New York City Department of City Planning as one of the authors, and the Municipal Art Society of New York, a private not-for-profit group interested in urban design and planning in New York City. So we're all listed here as authors. The copyright page says, indeed, that I wrote the book. It's copyrighted text by me, but we're all here, so we're all endorsing this, and there's a foreword by me, and a foreword by the chair, then chair of the City Planning Commission, and a foreword by the then president of the Municipal Art Society. So this is all approved by everybody. And here's the treatment that I gave to this very issue, and I'd just like to read it to you. This book was published in 2000. The zoning resolution is silent, however, when it comes to the owner's management of use by members of the public within the privately owned public space. To what extent may an owner craft and apply its own rules of conduct for members of the public? A number of spaces already display signs posted by the owner listing a substantial number of forbidden activities. The zoning resolution requires privately owned public spaces to host public use, but never expressly defines what limits, if any, an owner may impose upon such public use. The Department of City Planning has taken the position that an owner may prescribe, quote, reasonable, unquote, rules of conduct. In determining the definition of reasonable, the department has looked to rules of conduct applicable in city-owned parks for general guidance. Thus, for example, the department has considered a dog leash requirement, a ban on the consumption of alcoholic beverages, or a prohibition on sleeping in indoor spaces to be reasonable. On the other hand, suggestions by owners that they be allowed to exclude undesirable persons on some basis other than improper conduct, or to set limits on the amount of time a member of the public may sit in or otherwise use a space, have been considered unreasonable. Other fact patterns have and will arise to help sharpen the notion of reasonableness. For example, may an owner prohibit a member of the public from taking a photograph or speaking into a cassette recorder at a space? What about rules against listening to a radio, playing a musical instrument, or inline skating? May an owner bar political candidates, organizational representatives, or activist individuals from seeking signatures for a petition or from handing out literature? Question mark. That was 11 years ago. We're no further along in terms of defining what reasonable rules of conduct are than we were then, other than to apply our own smarts, our own intelligence as we think about this. So what rules then would be reasonable, and how might they intersect with the Occupy Wall Street effort? To begin with, in my judgment, a rule crudely prohibiting political activity within Zuccotti Park or any space should axiomatically fail the reasonableness test. Political activity, in my judgment, is simply reasonable conduct within a space, and it would be the unreasonable rule that would prohibit such activity. Can you imagine a more time-honored activity in a city than political activity in public spaces? Think, for example, about, just as an example, Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. Think about all of the protests, all of the parades, all of the expressions, political, ideological, entertaining, that have occurred in the public sphere in cities for literally centuries. That is simply part of the lifeblood, it's part of the energy, it's part of the reason, the raison d'etre for cities, to wit, the expression of ideas, in addition to the production of wealth that others have talked about. Some people have suggested that this is a free speech issue, overlooking the fact that in the United States, the free speech clause of the First Amendment in the 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights to the Constitution applies only against government action at national, state, and local levels, and not against private actions. A private owner of private space may do whatever he or she wants in terms of allowing or prohibiting speech, because the First Amendment doesn't apply against private action rather than government or state action. Some people have sought to suggest that Brookfield Properties, the owner of the space, is effectively here acting as a state actor and thereby doing state action, and thereby is indeed subject to the free speech clause, because this privately owned public space and cooperation with the city converts Brookfield into effectively a government actor. I finally don't think it matters for two reasons. First, as I suggested, I think under the zoning ordinance, reasonable rules should not be allowed to prohibit political activity in a space. That's number one. So, end of story. So, ironically, the biggest issue here raised by Occupy Wall Street is its enormous success. The footprint of its occupation is, to state the obvious, dominant. Yes, people unassociated with Occupy Wall Street may and do pass through the space, wander about, chat with movement members, take photographs, eat a sandwich, read a book. But the reality is that Zuccotti Park has literally been taken over by one group in a way that could easily mitigate the enjoyment of the public space by other members of the public, passive individual users. Or think about other groups that might like to use this space. Political competitors, flash mobs, skateboarders. And as you play the mind game of political competitors, plug in, not as a comparison to Occupy Wall Street, but plug in some other groups that at least viscerally and emotionally we all, or at least some of us, may be less sympathetic to. How would we feel if they were in there? Would our reactions be the same? Now, the very success of Occupy Wall Street is a terrific thing, and who can question their motives and the nobility of what they are doing. But my point about domination of the space, I hope, doesn't offend Occupy Wall Street. To be sure, its members are equally members of the public with a right to use Zuccotti Park, and they have exercised that right, indeed, with civility, humanity, and conviction. But I think at a certain point, and that point will come up, maybe it's now, they need to ask themselves whether, in satisfying their own needs, they are preventing multiple other publics from doing the same. First in time should not become first and in right, now and forevermore. One can imagine that as time goes on, perhaps their footprint should shrink to allow other people access to and use of the space. Imagine a graph expressing a relationship between space occupation and passage of time, where the vertical y-axis of the graph is percentage of space occupation, and the horizontal x-axis of the graph is the passage of time. So as you go out to the right horizontally along passage of time, you can imagine the line in the graph starts to decline. The slope starts to go down. The longer they are there, the less they can occupy the entire space. The more they have to provide space for others. Indeed, this is what Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park is all about in London. It's a corner. It's not all of Hyde Park. And indeed, under the First Amendment, constitutional law talks about when rules are content neutral, that is to say, when government rules don't discriminate against one kind of speech over another, government may impose what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. What time, what place, what manner. And no one has the right in any park, City Hall Park, or arguably under reasonable rules applied in Zuccotti Park, to go in and occupy the space all the time as a large group if it ends up preventing other people from having access to this space. Now, to be sure, there are close to 550 privately owned public spaces in the city. Why can't one group occupy this space and other people can use other spaces? That's part of the mix that needs to be discussed. It seems to me that finally, spatial pluralism here, allowing others to enter, may be a dilution of message, but it respectfully responds to the needs of many publics seeking to take advantage of the space. So, where do we go from here? Well, interestingly, one of the benefits of Occupy Wall Street, not contemplated by them when they started, but one of the great benefits has not only been to put on the table an enormously significant political issue, social issue, economic issue for all of us to contend with, to grapple with, to think about, but also to put on the table, how can we better use privately owned public space in the city of New York? In fact, inadvertently perhaps, but now expressly and intentionally, they give us an opportunity to think about how we can better use the 550 privately owned public spaces in New York City for all sorts of publics and all sorts of uses. Anybody reading the privately owned public space book, With the City's Ascent, can come away only with disappointment at the quality of many of the spaces. In fact, 41% of the 503 that were analyzed between 1961 and 2000. A full 41% of those 503 spaces were deemed of marginal quality. That is not good enough when in fact they are all meant to be good or better than good because the developers received concessions under the zoning ordinance that put money in their pocket. It's not necessarily their fault. They often followed the letter of the law. It just turns out that the original law was not demanding enough in terms of design requirements, in terms of amenities, and in terms of the types of activities that would finally occur in these spaces. And only starting in the 1970s and most recently under Chairwoman Amanda Burden's administration has the city really ratcheted up the kinds of requirements that would apply here. So this gives us finally the opportunity for a grand bargain among all members of the public in which the very issue of how we use public space in city can be discussed, can be argued about, how political activity sits next to somebody eating a sandwich, because at the end of the day, both are important. So let me stop there. Thank you very much, and take any questions that you may have. Hi.
Do you know what the status of Dewey Park in Boston is?
I do not. I mean, I fully understand, of course, that this is now a phenomenon across the country. And one has to be really careful to know one's facts. I could guess, but I'm being recorded, and I don't want to be promiscuous in my answers. There's been a lot of promiscuity about the actual status of Zuccotti Park. The New York Times got it wrong. The New York Observer has gotten some of this wrong originally. A lot of the blogs have gotten this wrong in terms of the legal provenance and what was provided by the city in return for this space. Primarily, a lot of reporting that says, you know, in return for providing Zuccotti Park, the owners received a floor area bonus, a significant one. In fact, the New York Times reported that they received over 500,000 square feet of bonus floor area. The truth is they didn't receive 1 square foot. Now, at the end of the day, that's not deeply consequential. They received other zoning concessions of value, and they agreed to provide the space. So it doesn't finally change the equation, but it just shows how unclear people are about these kinds of things. So before I answer your question about Dewey Square, I would really want to research it. The big cut, of course, is between publicly owned space and privately owned public space. Although I will tell you that, you know, just because something is a public space does not guarantee permanent access to that space for any kind of activity. And I showed you at the beginning the rules for City Hall Park. Can you imagine a more public space in a way? City Hall, it's called City Hall Park. You know, could, you know, Occupy Wall Street go there? No, not without applying for a permit. And I assure you, the city would say, you know, okay, you have a permit for a few hours. They're not going to give them a permit for 6 months, you know, and they won't do that anywhere. They won't do that in Central Park, and they won't do that in Boston Common and the Public Garden. They won't, you know, that's the reality across the land, and it's a very traditional kind of thing, and indeed even around the world. Hi.
I have a question about time, place, and manner.
Yes.
In doing so, aren't you kind of looking at a movement as if it's one thing, and couldn't anyone just apply for the permit, a different person each time? Like, people are kind of transient in these movements. Like, how do you kind of nail it down and say who can be here on Tuesday,
right.
and who can be here on Wednesday?
It's an excellent question, and when government is involved in any sort of picky-choosy kind of decision with regard to free speech, or for that matter, any sort of constitutional right, but free speech, and let's say government says, we like you, but we don't like you. So Josh, yes, Will, no. Well, it's a problem, okay? That's not content neutral anymore. That wouldn't be allowed. But if government is truly content neutral and develops rules that are reasonable, and if you said, well, what if the thousands that are there for Occupy Wall Street, each day somebody else applies, you know, they can develop rules to deal with it. That's just a management issue, which would say, look, part of democracy is pluralism. All right? And ironically, it might be fair to say that, you know, the new de facto owner of Zuccotti Park is actually Occupy Wall Street. In a very funny way, there's a sort of property ownership aspect to this. Not that they're asserting it. And by the way, they need to start thinking about this, and they are. It's a wonderful group of people and a wonderful movement, and they're being enormously creative, and I hope they grapple with this, and I'm not going to tell them what the answer should finally be, other than to put on the table and hope that they seriously address the possibility that other people should have access to where I am standing right now, that I can't be here forever, and just because I was here first and thought of it first doesn't mean it's mine. No, it's all of ours. So let's be sensitive to that. Let's develop processes for that, and indeed, let's have the owners of privately owned public space adopt perhaps consistent, unified rules across all of this public spaces, which would allow for large groups an application process for permits to use the space, which, by the way, occurs in some of the spaces that have gotten permission from the city to close the space 12 times a year, 6 times for not-for-profit groups, 6 times for their own private parties. And they need to have a process that is fair so that they don't say, I don't want that group, but I do want this kind of group. We have to be secular and open and neutral about how we make those sorts of choices. So that even to the point where if somebody wants to, if Occupy Wall Street wants to go into Trump Tower tomorrow and take it over, well, you know, how long can they really be there? I have no trouble, by the way, although some people do, with one person or several people going into Trump Tower, which, by the way, you may have thought it was a retail mall. It's actually a privately owned public space, as well as a retail mall. All of that is required to be open and accessible to the public during certain kinds of hours. And on the 4th and 5th levels, there are 2 outdoor spaces that are also required to be open and accessible to the public. One of them is uniformly locked, by the way, in violation of the law. As we speak, probably it's locked. But could I go in with a sign or a T-shirt that said, Donald Trump for dog catcher or Donald Trump for president? I assure you, if I had the former, guards would come to me instantaneously and ask me to leave. And if I were bold, I would say, well, I'm sorry, this is a privately owned public space. I believe I can do this activity here. And they would say, by that time I would be, you know, carried out. I could lie down on the floor. I could be passively resistant. I wouldn't call that civil disobedience because I think at the end of the day I would be victorious in court, but I can't be sure. Luckily, I'm a lawyer admitted in New York as well as a planner, and I could represent myself, saving money. Yes, sir. 41%.
41%. I'm not sure what marginal means. I imagine it has something to do with context, though, depending on what quality of the park is. So what responsibility do these owners of the public space have in affecting the marginality?
Right.
Can they, and does that mean that they should apply laws and rules to create a better space according to their own personal building vision?
Right. It's a very good question. The reality is that the 41% of spaces that are marginal are, I'm sad to say, not in violation of law. They are all in compliance with applicable legal requirements. There's another issue I'll raise in a moment. But in terms of our classification, and I say our meaning my with the city of New York, classification of spaces into 5 categories. Destination spaces, they're terrific. You know, you're a tourist from Tokyo, go visit the space. Very few of them. Neighborhood spaces. If you're in a 3-block radius, go have a sandwich, take a lunch there. They're nice spaces. Not that many. Hiatus space, the 3rd category. That's a space that if you happen to be literally next door to it, you know, walking by it, okay, step into it for a couple of minutes to smoke a cigarette, hopefully not, or to do something else there. But you wouldn't cross the street for it. But if you were there, it's got something of value. Circulation spaces, the 4th category, those are spaces that get you from point A to point B faster, perhaps out of the rain. And the 5th category is marginal, which dwarfs the other. That's 41%. And marginal means, you know, these spaces in their current form are useless. That's the bad news. The good news is there's a lot of space in the city that could be improved, could be upgraded. The owners aren't required to do it. They can just leave it there, and these are sort of desolate plazas and arcades. So you wouldn't even necessarily fully recognize them as a public space. Are you kidding me? The owner is renting out hundreds of thousands of extra square feet in the building, making a lot of money annually for this? But that was the deal. That was the zoning law, which requires us to be very, very careful. There's another set of spaces, by the way, that are in violation of law. That relates to privatization of public space and the way they're administered. That literally is a violation, and indeed, when a survey was done between 1998 and 2000, it was determined that roughly 50% of all buildings with privately owned public space or spaces had a space or spaces apparently in violation of applicable legal requirements, always resulting in privatization. And that fell into the categories of denial of access. You know, you can't come on this space, it's private. No, it isn't. Locked gates, these nighttime closings. What happens if in the morning the gate isn't opened? Oh, we forgot. Oh, we did, you know, that's a violation of law. So denial of access, one of the big violations. The second was annexation by adjacent commercial uses. So a restaurant or a cafe would spill into the space. Now, who doesn't love open-air cafes, outdoor cafes in a space? Well, you know who doesn't? Somebody who doesn't have enough money to sit down and pay for it. So it's income unequal. It's inequality. It's just what Occupy Wall Street would be about. And indeed, that's a violation. The city has a process through which people can apply to put one of those spaces there. But this would happen. It's what I called cafe creep, brasserie bulge, or trotteria trickle. But however you want to make it in alliteration form, it's privatization. And finally, there were diminution of required amenities. So the required movable seats, chairs in the space wouldn't be provided. Or ledges would have spikes on them that were required to be linear feet of seating. Suddenly you can't sit there because they have spikes. So one of the big issues I'm concerned about with my group, Advocates for Privately Owned Public Space, APOPS, is how do we encourage the upgrading of spaces where there is no legal obligation for the owners to do it. And there is one shining example that comes at a slight cost. It comes at a privatization cost, but I commend it to you. And that's a space that used to be called Harmony Atrium and now is called David Rubenstein Atrium. It's a space that has been adopted, which was my idea, adopting underperforming public spaces by a nearby user, in this case, Lincoln Center. And so Lincoln Center and Ren Levy, its president, saw a need for a sort of information kind of space where they could sell discount tickets. I saw a need for the upgrading of this space, which was a sad and depressing space. And that marriage has produced a spanking new space designed by Billy Chin and Todd Williams. Lincoln Center put in over $25 million to upgrade it. They are now getting something out of it. It feels a little bit like Lincoln Center space. So it's a little less public, but it's a great space in many, many ways and heavily used by the public now. So it's a real asset to the West Side and to the city of New York as a whole. Hi.
A question. If I'm an investor, I buy over this one Liberty Plaza, I decide to demolish it and rebuild it. I don't want a park. Can I just get rid of that park? If I don't want a concession, so I just build it.
Right. Right. The answer is no. Right now, you're fixed with, the existing conditions as they are.
I have to take that. So
As it is, you'd have to get approval. Does anybody know what time it is? I don't have my watch. Okay, we're going to end in time for one more question, and that's it. Okay, yes.
What happens regarding maintenance of the park and liability for the private owner?
Yeah, it's the owner's responsibility to maintain the park. And indeed, it is liable, and that's part of the argument that they're making. How can we be responsible for this sort of thing? And I think there would be certainly accommodations there facing the reality of what this is about. The city does not have any responsibility for policing that space any more than it would for any private property. All right, so if I call from my house the police because I think someone's breaking into my house, the police do come. But they're not my private security force. And so, in theory, the police have no more right or responsibility to engage with, Zuccotti Park and Occupy Wall Street than on any other private property, and nor does the sanitation department. But let me end with the fact, the police and the city of New York are absolutely delighted about the fact that this is happening not on their space, but on Brookfield office property space. So I think we can all be very positive and excited about this. It requires us to really understand these spaces, to think about them. This is a celebration of cities and public space. But it doesn't come without its challenges, and that's what we're all about. So thank you very much.